In 2024, Japan hosted more foreign tourists than almost any nation on Earth. 36 million people crossed its borders. They came for the food, the temples, the rail system that runs to the second. And almost universally, they left as advocates, people who didn't just enjoy Japan, but who returned home and told everyone they knew that Japan was different. Special, worth defending. That is not an accident. That is policy. Japan has spent centuries engineering exactly that reaction, not just in tourists, but in rivals, occupiers, trading partners, and former enemies. The question is how? Because Japan has no oil, no rare earth dominance, a military constitutionally restricted since 1945, a population in demographic freefall. By every traditional measure of geopolitical power, Japan should be a minor player, a scenic island chain with a polite culture and an aging workforce. Instead, it sits at the center of the most consequential alliance network in Asia, culturally exports to every continent, and has converted its most dangerous historical adversaries into its closest partners. This video is about the mechanism behind that transformation. Japan is one of the most geopolitically constrained nations in history. It sits on a volcanic archipelago with almost no natural resources, no strategic depth, surrounded by larger continental powers, China, Russia, Korea, each of which has at various points in history viewed Japan as either a threat or a target. And yet Japan has survived for 2 millennia as a distinct civilization. Not just survived, synthesized, adapted, and in several critical periods, redirected the very forces that threaten to overwhelm it. Most people, when they think about Japan's power, think about Sony, Toyota, or anime. That's real. But it's the surface layer. The deeper mechanism is something historians rarely name directly. Japan has an extraordinary institutional capacity to convert adversarial relationships into dependencies, not through conquest, not through coercion, through a systematic process of absorption, transformation, and strategic generosity that leaves former enemies not just neutralized, but invested in Japan's success. We're going to examine 4 specific mechanisms that make this work. Each has deep historical roots, each has a modern manifestation, and together they form a playbook that no other nation has quite replicated. The story begins not with Japan exporting culture, but with Japan being overwhelmed by it. For centuries, China was the dominant civilizational force in East Asia. Chinese writing, Chinese philosophy, Chinese bureaucratic models, Chinese religion. Buddhism arrived via China. Confucian ethics arrived via China. Even the concept of a centralized imperial state arrived via China. By the 6th and 7th centuries, Japan was absorbing Chinese influence at a rate that, by any historical precedent, should have led to cultural assimilation. That is what normally happens when a smaller civilization encounters a dominant one. It gets absorbed. Look at the peoples Rome conquered. They became Roman. Look at what the Mongols did to the steppe cultures they overran. They were either eliminated or dissolved. Japan did something different. It took everything China offered and made it Japanese. The writing system was adopted, then transformed into hiragana and katakana, phonetic scripts that serve Japanese grammar in ways Chinese characters never could. Buddhism arrived, then fused with Shinto animism to create a spiritual synthesis found nowhere else on Earth. Confucian hierarchies were adopted, then reinterpreted to emphasize loyalty to clan and emperor in distinctly Japanese ways. By the 9th century, Japan had absorbed the most powerful civilizational force in its world and emerged with a stronger, more defined sense of its own identity than it had before the encounter. This is the first mechanism, absorption without dissolution. Japan takes external influence in at full force, processes it through existing cultural frameworks, and produces something that is simultaneously familiar to outsiders and unmistakably Japanese. This pattern recurs across every major period of Japanese history, and it does something geopolitically powerful. It makes Japan legible enough to engage with and distinct enough to be fascinating. The Tang dynasty scholar who visited Japan in 838 recognized elements of home, but he also found something he couldn't categorize. That productive confusion is a strategic asset. It draws engagement without inviting domination. 45. Should have been the end of Japan as a major power. The country had lost 2 million soldiers, its cities were ash, its economy had collapsed. It was under military occupation by the most powerful nation in history, a nation whose cultural confidence in the post-war period was nearly absolute. The United States occupied Japan, rewrote its constitution, restructured its economy, redesigned its educational system, and established military bases that remain to this day. By any conventional analysis, Japan in 1947 was a defeated, dependent client state. What happened instead is one of the most remarkable strategic reversals in modern history. Japan used the occupation as a mechanism for transformation rather than a source of humiliation. Japanese technocrats worked alongside American administrators and quietly, systematically shaped the reconstruction to serve Japanese long-term interests. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry, MITI, guided American-style market liberalization into channels that protected Japanese industrial development. The constitutional restrictions on military spending, imposed by the Americans, were reframed internally not as humiliation, but as strategic freedom. Japan didn't need to spend on defense because America would provide it. That freed capital for infrastructure, education, and industrial investment that produced the economic miracle of the 1960s and 70s. More remarkably, Japan converted its occupier into its primary security guarantor and its largest trading partner simultaneously. The United States, which had firebombed Tokyo and dropped nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, became, within a generation, the country that Japanese citizens consistently named in polls as their closest ally and most trusted partner. That conversion didn't happen through Japanese resentment being suppressed. It happened through Japanese strategic decision-making at the highest levels. Engage with American culture, send students to American universities, invite American investment, host American bases, and in doing so, make American success dependent on Japanese stability. By 1980, the United States and Japan were so economically intertwined that conflict between them was nearly unthinkable. The former occupier had been converted into an indispensable partner. This is the second mechanism, defeat as opportunity. Japan has an institutional reflex, encoded across centuries of navigating more powerful neighbors, to treat overwhelming external force not as something to resist, but as something to redirect, like a martial art applied to geopolitics. Japan didn't plan its cultural empire. It stumbled into one, and then quietly perfected it. In the late 1970s and 1980s, Japanese consumer electronics, Sony Walkmans, Nintendo consoles, Honda engines, began appearing in living rooms across Europe and America. This was primarily an economic phenomenon, but something else was happening underneath it. People who owned Japanese products became curious about Japan. Anime, which had been a domestic entertainment medium, began leaking into international markets through informal distribution, then formal licensing. By the 1990s, there were children in Sao Paulo, Lagos, and Warsaw who had grown up watching Dragon Ball Z and considered Japan's aesthetic universe part of their own imaginative landscape. The Japanese government noticed. In 2002, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs began tracking what scholars were calling soft power, the ability to attract and persuade rather than coerce. Japan scored extraordinarily high. Its cuisine had spread globally. Its design philosophy, minimalism, precision, the elevation of craft, resonated across cultures with very different aesthetic traditions. Its popular culture, from Studio Ghibli to manga, had created a generation of international advocates who had never visited Japan but felt genuine emotional attachment to it. In 2012, the government launched the Cool Japan Initiative, an explicit program to leverage cultural exports as diplomatic instruments. But the interesting thing is that the cultural exports that actually worked, that created real international affinity, were almost entirely organic. They weren't planned by the ministry. They grew from genuine creative energy in Japanese studios, kitchens, and design offices. What the government did was recognize the pattern and create infrastructure around it. Today, Japan's cultural influence operates as a kind of pre-diplomatic softening agent. Nations that might otherwise approach Japan with historical grievance or competitive suspicion have populations saturated with Japanese cultural references they received voluntarily, that they associate with pleasure and creativity. This is the third mechanism, making the world want you before you ask for anything. It creates what one American political scientist called permission to engage, a baseline of goodwill that makes every subsequent diplomatic interaction easier. Japan and South Korea share one of the most complicated bilateral relationships in modern geopolitics. Japan colonized Korea from 1910 to 1945. The exploitation was severe. Forced labor, cultural suppression, systematic humiliation. Korean historical memory of this period is deep, politically charged, and entirely legitimate. For decades after the war, Japan-Korea relations lurched between functional cooperation and periodic eruption over historical grievances. Comfort women, Yasukuni shrine visits, textbook controversies. By rights, this relationship should be Japan's most intractable strategic problem. Instead, examine what has actually happened at the cultural level. Korean popular culture, K-pop, Korean cinema, Korean drama, exploded globally in the 2010s. And where did Korean producers, directors, and entertainment executives study their craft? In many cases, Japan. The Japanese entertainment industry, its idol system, its manga-to-anime pipeline, its approach to fan engagement directly influenced the Korean wave that swept the world. South Korean fans of Japanese anime and Japanese music in the 1990s became the creators of the K-pop industrial complex in the 2010s. Japan's cultural influence seeded its rivals' cultural ascendancy, and rather than triggering resentment, this created a strange cultural intimacy. Japanese and Korean youth culture today is intensely cross-pollinated. Japanese young people consume Korean content. Korean young people consume Japanese content. The diplomatic relationship remains fraught at the governmental level, especially over wartime history, but at the civil society level, a convergence is underway that makes outright hostility increasingly difficult to sustain. Japan didn't engineer this, but it didn't resist it either. It created the conditions, through decades of cultural openness, genuine creative output, and strategic patience, that allowed former enemies to become, if not friends, then at minimum deeply entangled neighbors with too much shared cultural investment to afford clean breaks. This is the fourth mechanism, patient entanglement, not conquest, not coercion. The slow accumulation of shared references, dependencies, and investments until separation becomes more costly than coexistence. Notice the pattern. 4 mechanisms. 4 very different historical moments. But one underlying logic. Japan consistently converts adversarial relationships into relationships of mutual dependency. It does this not through military force, which it rarely had in sufficient quantity, and not through economic coercion, which requires resource dominance Japan has never possessed. It does it through something more subtle and more durable. It makes itself necessary. China was Japan's cultural overlord for centuries. Japan absorbed everything China offered, made it distinctively Japanese, and in doing so became a separate civilizational pole that could negotiate rather than simply receive. The United States was Japan's military conqueror and occupier. Japan engaged so completely with American culture and economic interests that the occupation became a partnership, and the partnership became an alliance that neither side could afford to abandon. Korea was Japan's former colony, carrying generational trauma. Japanese cultural exports created intimacy at the popular level even when governmental relations remained poisoned. The international community, shaped by post-war guilt and Cold War priorities, became the audience for Japan's reinvention, and Japan performed that reinvention so convincingly that its reputation recovered faster than almost any defeated power in modern history. What connects all of this is an institutional disposition that runs deeper than any single government or policy. Japan treats every external relationship as a long-term cultivation project, not manipulation, cultivation. There's a difference. Manipulation extracts, cultivation invests. Japan invests in relationships, in cultural output, in economic partnerships, in the kind of soft infrastructure that takes decades to build and is nearly impossible to dismantle. And here's what complicates this picture. It doesn't always work. Japan's relationship with China today is tense, competitive, and increasingly adversarial at the governmental level despite deep economic interdependence. The historical wounds from the Second Sino-Japanese War and questions about Japanese wartime accountability remain genuinely unresolved. The patient entanglement strategy has limits when the other party has its own civilizational confidence and its own long-term strategy. China is not Korea, not the United States, not a smaller neighbor, that can be gradually won over. So Japan's playbook, extraordinary as it is, operates within constraints, and understanding those constraints is as important as understanding the playbook itself. There is a concept in Japanese aesthetics called ema, the power of empty space. The pause between notes, the void that gives the surrounding structure meaning. Western aesthetics tend to fill space. Japanese aesthetics tend to shape it. Japan's geopolitical strategy has something of this quality. Where other nations see confrontation and fill it with force, Japan tends to leave space and then shape what grows in that space over time. It absorbs rather than resists. It cultivates rather than conquers. It entangles rather than dominates. And over centuries, this approach has produced something remarkable. A small, resource-poor island nation that sits at the center of the world's most consequential alliance, that exports culture to every continent, that converted its military conqueror into its closest ally, and that remains, despite every structural disadvantage, one of the most globally admired nations on Earth. The 21st century is going to test this playbook severely. China's rise, North Korea's weapons program, demographic collapse, and questions about whether American security guarantees will hold are not challenges that patient cultural cultivation can solve alone. Japan knows this. It is quietly, deliberately building a more conventional security posture, new defense spending, new bilateral agreements, a more assertive diplomatic stance. The question is whether Japan can add hard power to its soft power arsenal without losing what makes the soft power work. The perception of Japan as a nation that prefers partnership to confrontation. Because the moment Japan is seen as just another geopolitical competitor, the cultural goodwill that took centuries to build becomes far less reliable. Can a nation famous for turning enemies into allies remain that nation when the enemies it faces don't want to be turned? That's not a rhetorical question. It's the defining strategic challenge of Japan's next 50 years, and the answer will reshape East Asia more than any military buildup. What do you think? Does Japan's soft power playbook still work in an era of great power competition?